The purpose of this video is to show you how to generate an interval or grouped frequency table. Now we typically will generate an interval frequency table when the range of values for a data set is large, such as when there are more than 10 units in the range of values. Now when this happens, we can condense that wide range of values into fewer intervals that are easier for us to consume as human beings. Now make sure that you have your Excel spreadsheet open and then also the directions in the Word document available so that you can follow along and replicate what I do. Of course, just as always, you are welcome to pause the video at any time to get caught up or to do your work in your spreadsheet as well. Now the first thing that we always do when opening a spreadsheet is to check the codebook and make sure that we understand how the variable was collected and how it is being measured. So if you're looking at the data set for the interval frequency table, you're going to see that the label of our variable is coffee. Again, there's a lot of different ways that we can measure coffee. It looks like when we hover over the label itself, that is the dollar spent on coffee. But we're still going to go down to the code book just to take a look and make sure that there isn't any surprises there. And so here was the question that was asked participants. The question was, on average, how much do you spend on coffee per week? So now that we know the context of what this variable is, we now know that each of these values represents a dollar amount. So this person number 6 spent $1 on coffee. All right, and so that's always the very first step whenever we're working with a spreadsheet. Now I mentioned that the first 4 steps are very much the same, so let's go a little bit quicker here. Step number 2 is getting our pivot table. So again, we'll go to Insert, go to Pivot Table. I'll make sure that we select the column that we're going to use for this particular table, which will be column letter B. And then we'll go down to where it says Existing Worksheet. I'll click the dial there, and I'm going to select a location, again, a few columns away from your data, just in case you have to do any type of manipulation with your data. And we'll click OK. And just like it was with the standard frequency table, you'll see that we have a pivot table fields over here on the right side of the spreadsheet. So let's go down to step number 3. So again, we want to select our variable, just like we did in the last video. Once we click on it, you'll see that it shows up, at least my default is showing up in the sum of values. But remember, we want it to show up in rows once and sum of values twice. So I have to drag that variable down into the rows box and then drag it one more time into that sum of values box. Now once I do that, I have my 3 columns of data for my table. Now I need to go through and make sure that each of these values represent what I want it to represent. So the second column should be the count. Currently it's the sum, so that's not what I want. So I'm going to right click here and I'm going to show summary values by, and I'm going to go down to count. So now it's the count of coffee. So now I can see that the number of people that are spending $5 a week on coffee looks like it's 7. So 7 participants in my data set spending $5 on coffee. Now this third column I want to be a percent, so I need to change it. But currently it says sum, so I got to change it to a count, and then I have to change it to a percent. So I'll right click, summarize values by count. I'll right click again on that label, and I'm going to show values as the percent of the grand total. All right, and so up to this point, those 4 steps are exactly the same as it was for a standard frequency table. Let's go down to step number 5. So remember, with a standard frequency table, there was much more to step number 5 here because that was the final step for that particular table. We have more to do here with this table here for the interval frequency table. So all we really need to do here at step 5 is just rename all of our columns and give our table a title. So instead of saying score here for that first label, I'm actually going to say intervals, because we are going to create intervals that represents the respondents of our participants. The second column, I'm going to type in frequency, just like before. And then just like the last video as well, this last column is going to be frequency percent. I mentioned before that you can adjust your the length of each of your columns, or the width of each of your columns, by going to the top and going between the 2 letters there, and then you can drag it to where you want it to be. You can also double left click and it'll automatically adjust. Sometimes people want more control and so they do it manually, but you can do it either way, right? And it'll get you the labels and the spacing in your table just to be a little bit better so it's not so spread out. So we have our labels for each of our columns. Let's go ahead and give this a title. So we can say frequency of dollars spent on coffee in a week. So now our table is titled. Let's going to go down to step number 6 now. So this is where we're actually going to group the variable into those intervals. So it's going to make it an interval frequency table. And you see that the very first thing that we're going to do here is we're going to right click on the first value under the first column title. So here's my first column title, it's the one that's labeled intervals. I'm going to right click on the cell right below it. And when I do it, there's an option here for grouping. So we'll say group, I'll click on it, and it's going to open up this dialog box here. And in this particular dialog box, you're going to notice that down here in the directions, it says do not uncheck or change the starting at or ending at, right, the minimum max number values in this particular table. So we're going to leave those exactly how they are. We're not going to uncheck them. We're not going to change those values. We'll leave them as they are. And the starting at is just telling us what the minimum value is. The ending at is telling us the maximum value in our particular data set. Now what we do want to look at is this by field right here, this third field. And it's going to default with a 10 in there. And so essentially what that's saying is that the interval width should be 10, which is not necessarily what we want here. We have to actually calculate the interval width that we want for this particular data set. So just make sure that you remember what this by field is. A lot of students end up having a lot of difficulty, especially when it comes to an exam, remembering what this by field is. A lot of times they think it's the number of intervals. That is not what it is here. It's actually the interval width. So if you go down to your directions here, you'll see interval width. It's highlighted there, again highlighted so that you remember how to do the calculation and know that it's not the number of intervals, but rather the range of values for one particular interval, what we call the interval width. Now to calculate the interval width, just like was shown in the lecture, we are going to take the full range and divide by the number of intervals. Now we haven't specified the number of intervals here. Now when it comes to an exam, I'll tell you how many intervals I want you to use. But let's just say here we're going to use 7 intervals. So what I need to do now is I need to calculate the full range of values. And so go back to the lecture, make sure you know the difference between a range and a full range. But mathematically, the full range is just the max value minus the minimum value plus something. And usually that something is a 1, but it doesn't always have to be. It could be something else. If you have a very small value, such as decimals, then maybe you want to do like a 0.1. If you have a lot of values that are really, really large, that are in like the thousands, then maybe you want to use 100 or maybe 1,000 or something like that. So just realize that something can be different values. Ultimately, what is right is what works. And so if the value you add gives you your 7 intervals, then that's perfectly fine. And so if one person uses a 1, another person uses a 3, that's fine as long as it gives you the 7 intervals that you need to complete the question or to complete the assignment. All right, so let's go ahead and calculate this interval width. So again, we want to use the max minus the minimum. We'll add something to it and we'll divide, in this case, by 7, right? We said we want 7 intervals. So, the denominator will be 7 here. So it looks like my max value is 76. If I was to subtract the minimum of 0, I'm left with 76. Now I got to add something to that to get the full range of values. It makes sense here that our values aren't incredibly small, they're not incredibly large, that a 1 is going to work just fine here. So I'm going to take 76 minus 0, I'm going to add 1 to that. So essentially it's going to be 76 plus 1, and that's going to give me 77. Now remember I said that I wanted 7 intervals, so I'm going to take 77 and divide by 7. If you take 77 and divide by 7, you end up with an interval width of 11. So I'm going to change this by field from 10 to 11. That each interval in my table, so each of those 7 intervals in my table, will have a range of values, the width of being 11. And that's what we really want to do here. All right, so I'm going to click OK, and that's going to go ahead and group the data in the table. So once I click OK, you'll see that most of the work for our table is complete. There is some small things that we need to do to make the table more informational. So you're going to notice in here that if you're looking at these ranges of values, it goes from a 0 to 11, then it goes from 11 to 22. That causes a problem there. We can't have 11 in both places, so we'll need to make an adjustment there. Other thing you're going to notice is that it looks like there's a missing interval because we go from 44 to 55 here, and then it jumps to 66, so we're missing an interval. So if you're looking at your directions there, you're going to see right here it says intervals with frequency counts of 0 will not be automatically shown. Right, so you want to make sure that you do this next step even if you don't have any missing intervals. And so this next step is to right click the first value under the first column. Right here, it says blank here, but if I right click, I can go from there and go down to field settings. Again, that's what our directions are telling us. Click on field settings. Then we're going to click on the layout and print tab. So if you notice here in the dialog box, you're going to see this tab right here that says layout and print. We're going to click on that. And we're going to go down here where it says show items with no data. So again, that would be our intervals that don't have any frequency count. So we're just going to check that box, and then we're going to click OK. And you'll notice that once you do that, you'll notice you get that missing interval, that 55 to 66. It doesn't have a count there, but now it's showing up. Now you also know it does give us one extra row down here at the bottom. So when we get done with this table, we will have to remove both the first row that says blank and this last one that says greater than 77, but we'll take care of that at the end. All right, so now that we have our missing interval, you're going to notice that there's a blank there, and it shouldn't be a blank, it should actually be a 0 because there's no values between 55 and 65.99. And so we need to make sure that we get a value in there. So that's the next step in our directions here. Again, we're going to right click on the cell in the pivot table that we just did that says blank here. So we'll right click. But instead of going to field settings, we're now going to go to pivot table options. Once there, we'll go to this in the dialog box, this option right here. It says for empty cells show. So basically saying for any empty cells, what do you want to put there? And we want to put a 0, right? We want to show that there is no count in that particular cell. And then once you do that, you can click OK. And notice what happens is that any of those empty cells in a table are now have zeros as placeholders. And so now our table is more complete. We can see that for that range of 55 to 66, that in this case, there are no responses between those two values. Once you have filled those empty cells with 0, we can go down to the next step. So notice that we're going to have to hide those two rows that have frequency counts of 0. So that's going to be that first one here that says blank, and this last one here that's greater than 77. So the first and last rows we're going to hide. Note that the one in the middle with the 0 count is perfectly fine, right? That frequency of 0, as long as it's in the middle, is perfectly fine. In fact, it makes our table more complete. So we don't want to hide that one. We only want to hide the first and the last one because they add no information to our particular table here. So just like it was in the last video for the standard frequency table, I am going to right click. I will go down to filter and hide selected items. So I'll do that for the first row, and then I'll also do it for the last row. All right, and so there's our table now. So we've removed those two. Now we're just left with the intervals, the 7 intervals that we should have for our particular table. There is one last thing that we need to do before we conclude our table, and the last thing is that we need to adjust our intervals so that there's no overlap. And so again, I mentioned earlier that this first interval goes from 0 to 11, and then the next interval goes from 11 to 22. So the question is, if I have 11 in my data set, so someone who's spending $11 in a week on coffee, where is that being counted? Is it being counted under the first row, or is it being counted under the second row? So is it part of this 43, or is it part of this 24? And so in actuality, it's actually part of the second row where it says 24 here. So any 11s in our data set is being counted in the second interval, in our table. So that means we need to make adjustments just so that there's no confusion for our audience. And so what we're going to do is we're going to make the second value in each interval just slightly smaller than the first value in the next interval. So for this first interval, I'm going to go up here to my function box so I can edit. I'll backspace, and I'm going to change that from 11 to 10.99. And I'll do that for each one of my intervals. So this next one will go from 22 to 21.99. So note what we're doing here is that this interval is going to stop right before the next one begins. And technically this is repeating. So when we say 21.99, it's really 21.99999 repeated for an infinity. So just right before 22. But we'll do this for all of our intervals. That way there is no overlap, and anyone looking at our table is not going to be confused where a certain value might fall in the table. Now don't forget to do this very last one. I sometimes see that on an exam. Remember, one of our criteria for our group frequency table or interval frequency table is that the intervals have to be the same width. If you don't do the last one, then you won't have equal intervals. The last one will be slightly larger than the others, so do not forget to get this last one. In this case, 76.99. All right, so that's it. That is an interval frequency table or a group frequency table. You should be able to save your file now and just make sure that you upload it to the assignment.